Hi everybody, my name is Dennis and welcome back to another album review. Today we are reviewing the latest record from R.A.P. Ferreira entitled Bob's Son. Now, I went into this thing really excited. R.A.P. Ferreira, I think, is a phenomenal artist. Previously known as Milo, he has a very unique flow, he has a unique style, he's got a great voice for it, and even though I do think his flow and his voice it's been very alienating for a lot of people. I've seen many criticize it and say that despite liking the instrumentals or the lyrics, they just can't get into it because of him as a rapper. And I can understand that, but at the same time, I think that's kind of what makes his charm. He raps in a unique and an uncommon, almost an avant-garde type of way, and I think it really suits the kind of style and messaging that he goes for. He released one of my favorite albums of last year, in Purple Moonlight Pages, which is a phenomenal jazz rap album. It, goes over so many different aspects of life and self-reflection and all these different stories that make up oneself, but he tells them through the lenses of seemingly much more simple and down-to-earth things. Across some gorgeously unique jazz instrumentals, it was easily one of the best albums I heard last year. So going into this, I wasn't entirely certain what to expect, because he does try many different things, even if it tends to be within the same style, but I was still excited to go into this. And I will say off the bat, I did not enjoy this nearly as much as I enjoyed Purple Moonlight Pages. However, there is still a lot to love here. So Bob's Son is kind of a love letter of sorts to the late Bob Kaufman, who was a poet in the mid-1900s, who was quite revolutionary in his themes at the time. Talking about, almost themes of anarchy, where he was frustrated with the way the government had been treating black people at the time. And just the way that he used all of these different symbolisms and even creating new words at times to describe certain ideas, it was really, really powerful, and he is definitely an underrated poet. And R.A.P. Ferreira here cites Bob Kaufman as such an inspiration to him, to the point where he feels that he himself is Bob's artistic son of sorts, hence the name of the album. So I was really excited to see where he would go with this once I kind of understood that backstory, and the results were generally pretty good. I think that R.A.P. Ferreira's songwriting is basically at its peak here. It is really consistent across this whole album, but I generally wasn't as in love with the instrumentals as I was on his previous work. So to get into more specific tracks, I thought the intro was just okay. It's one of the shorter tracks on here, but it's just kind of this introduction where it repeats over and over again. Even though it doesn't necessarily say the same phrases, it's about, you're listening to Bob's Son, this is Bob's Son. And it kind of just goes on this for an awkward amount of time. The instrumentals aren't really anything to phone home about. And I really could have just done without this intro. To me, it was probably one of, if not the weakest point on this whole record. However, the album does pick up from there. The Cough Bomber's return. Now, the Cough Bomber is what he refers to Bob Kaufman as. So, when he talks about the Cough Bomber and now the Cough Bomber's return, he's talking about Bob Kaufman and now the spiritual successor to Bob Kaufman that is himself. So, we really have him starting to establish his character here as Bob's son, and just discuss how much he appreciates Bob Kaufman as a poet. And even though he doesn't say this directly, the metaphors and symbolism he uses to get to this point are quite gorgeous lyrically. And I also think in this track that the pianos are quite nice and really do support this jazzy spoken word poetry type feel. And he also, towards the end of the track, as the beat switches, much in line with the avant-garde jazz that he is so much inspired by, we have, again, like these three sections within the track where we have, some gorgeous pianos, then we switch it up with this with this odd little interlude piece, and then we have a different kind of melody that goes on through the rest of the track that is also, I thought, quite nice. And here, towards the end, he talks about how his life is almost dominated by poetry, and how it's had such a deep impact on him. And he also brings up some symbolism that is much more clear later on in the album in the form of oatmeal cookies, where they are meant to represent a sense of peace, happiness, and tranquility of sorts, and how almost, how how Bob Kaufman's music and now R.A.P. Ferreira's music, or not even music, but the poetry, the lyrics, were the oatmeal cookies of their time. So great track to really start things off as far as, the actual meat of this record. And the following track, Yamships Flax Script, is another really great one, where it starts to go from the inspiration to the urge to become better, and kind of the madness that inspires poetry. Where we have him start to question society, looking for answers of why things don't make sense. And he eventually sees how the pain that he feels comes in these abstract dreams of sorts, where the only way to express it is through the abstract lens of poetry. It's another great track with a great instrumental that I really, really enjoyed on here. The following track, Diogenes on the Auction Block, is not one of my favorites on here, even if I do really love the lyricism. I think the first half of the track is relatively bland in its instrumentation. I wish there was some more power or some more moving parts that go into it, and I can understand why he opts for this kind of instrumentation here and on other tracks that's very simplistic and, doesn't really have a true tune or melody to it of sorts. But for me, it just doesn't do a lot. I get you want to honor Bob Kaufman and do things more from a poet's sense than a musician's sense, but when I'm listening to the album, that just doesn't really do a lot for me in the listening experience. And if this doesn't bother you, if you love the poetry side of it, then I can see you absolutely adoring this record. But on this track and more tracks to come that I'll talk about, I just struggle to get past that, where I love what he's saying, but I just don't have all that much fun listening to it. But again, lyrically on here, he talks about being a slave in multiple senses, whether it's to a world, a slave to poetry, and how all of these different ideas create so many different personalities in oneself. And you express this through your poetry. And then the difficulties in acknowledging that the poetry, even though you can express it, doesn't necessarily fix anything. Where he makes reference to rapping not solving any of the problems, but, let's listen to another song, because that's essentially all that we have at this point. The following track, Red Guard Snipers, is another track that I have some issues with. I think the instrumental is okay. I don't really like the awkward cuts in the beat that go throughout it. Every time there's one of those random cuts, it really takes me out of the moment, and it's to me one of the best written tracks on here. So I was really disappointed for the instrumentals to have these awkward moments that really just take me out of the moment. I can never really get engaged with this track. But it's all about just the development linguistically that poetry has had. Where we have a new earth, a new words, new slurs, new verbs, all these new things from poetry, where it's such a creative force, where you are using your power and your will not to destroy or bring others down, but to create new things. And he talks about why that makes him frustrated with a lot of modern rap that kind of gets rid of that beauty, in a way. The following track, Sips of Ripple Wine, is kind of going on how the poetry would land on deaf ears. And even though for those who cared to pay attention, these different elements would bring a sense of peace and tranquility, like I brought out before, there were people that were committing atrocities, and they were too busy doing these to really see that they were atrocities. but he is so thankful that seeing like this rap, this poetry, seeing how it all developed really gave him the answers he was looking for. And despite all this, why is the sample so bad? It just does not sound good. The almost Jay-Z 444 type sampling, it just doesn't really work here. There's not enough going on to really support it, and the production otherwise is just relatively boring. Strength, the next song, I thought, as far as writing goes, this wasn't one of my favorites. It doesn't really develop the themes as well. It does to some extent of talking about how poetry's not a choice. When you are a poet, you don't choose it, you know it, and you're stuck with it. I thought the beat was okay. He talks about hiding ideas in plain sight, realizing that he is a poet, but it just doesn't really do a whole lot for me. Another track later on called Listening, I have similar issues with, of it just not really developing the themes as well as I would have liked. There's just not as much depth here as there is in other tracks. However, other than this, we actually have a lot of the highlights of the record. Bobby Digital's Little Wings is a great song. It's all about him sharing his appreciation of jazz and his appreciation of poetry with those around him, including specifically his son. He encourages sensitivity and emotional openness, where he talks about, black history and the struggles that lead to this kind of writing. I thought the piano melody was quite nice as well, and it really brings this whole track together to be a great experience. High Rise in Newark, another really great song. The instrumentals are some of the most gorgeous on here, and he talks about his frustration with the ignorance that he sees in the world. How there's this irony of intelligent people doing stupid things, where he talks about, computer scientists forgetting the passwords to their computers. It's like you can have as much intelligence as you want, but if you don't, stop to actually see what's going on in the world, you are just as dumb as everyone else. He talks about, rather than watching, Dancing with the Stars, he's going to be watching the stars. Just kind of appreciating the world in a spiritual sense rather than a physical sense. I thought it was a really nice idea that kind of shows the different worldview that a poet can have. Rejoice is another amazing song that comes after it that kind of accentuates these themes even further. Where, we see where you look at poets and artists and other people of the sort in less common areas, where we see them, in odd places like sewers and cafes that, the average person wouldn't spend a lot of time at or really take the time to appreciate. And he just really goes over why being a poet is such a unique thing. You see things in a different light. And he kind of concludes this song off with what I thought was one of the most interesting lines on the record, where he says, "Welcome to my rap show," said the spider to the fly. Where again we have this theme of people not really appreciating the poetry of rap anymore. Where, welcome to my rap show, and you think, oh, well, this person, is, making enjoyable music, but it is just poison. It's poison for you. And even though I don't necessarily agree with this sentiment altogether, I do think, just because something isn't necessarily lyrically profound, that doesn't necessarily make it bad in itself. I do really like the way it's worded, and I can completely understand his frustration based on the way he presents it. I do think that the mixing on this track could have been a tad bit better, but it still sounds really amazing. That's just a small nitpick I have. And the closing track, Abomunist Manifesto, is one of the, if not the most direct allusion to Bob Kaufman, where he has, one of his most famous poems is of the same name, the Abomunist Manifesto, where abomunism is not really a thing in itself, but is more of a concept that Bob Kaufman invented. It's about, like was mentioned earlier in the record, about, this kind of anti-government frustration, almost looking for anarchy to escape the racism and persecution that has been plaguing black people for generations now. Where we are just living in such an unfair society. The opening, I didn't really like the instrumentals of about the first half of this track, but they really started to grow on me as I took the time to appreciate the parallelism between these instrumentals and the lyrics, where it's very minimal, it's very bleak, and we have this list of abomunism is this, and abomunists do this, and abomunists are this, where it's, just the frustrations of life, where, abomunists, they will drink themselves to death for their country. They will do all these things that seem so bleak, depressing, and even negative. It makes you think, I wouldn't want to be considered within this group. But then the reason that there are all these struggles is because it is in the pursuit and the desire of something so much better, where you are frustrated and you are, you know, fighting against something, but, you know, it is all for something really, really beautiful. The instrumentals become probably the most gorgeous piece across this entire record at the very end, with just these phenomenal melodies and these just heartwarming and eye-watering instrumentals that are really just so gorgeous. As he starts to list these things that you just want from the world, or you're sick of the the persecution, you're sick of it being so unfair, and you just wish that life was better, and you just wish that there were just nothing but oatmeal cookies. You just want the oatmeal cookies in life, where something simple, something sweet, something happy, and it's there's so much fight. There's so much fight to get to this point, and you become miserable almost. Again, drinking yourself to death for your country because you want the good things in life. You want happiness for yourself and everyone around you. And again, you just you just want those oatmeal cookies. And yeah, so I guess that's kind of my thoughts on the album. It's really gorgeous at points, and it is really profoundly powerful, and I think it is a gorgeous letter of appreciation to Bob Kaufman. I wish that there were parts of it that I had more enjoyment actually listening to, even if I do appreciate the lyrics in themselves. But it's still a really good album that I think is worth checking out at least once. It very well may not be in your style. A lot of the tracks on here may not really resonate with you, but I think some of the parts here really are growers. There's a lot to be had here, and there's so much lyrical depth here that if I really wanted to break it down entirely, we could be here for well over an hour. So I think I'm going to leave it to that. I'm feeling a light 7 on this record. I enjoyed it. It was good, flawed, and I don't really see myself coming back to a lot of these individual tracks in the future, but it is still an enjoyable project as a whole overall. So with that being said, be sure to tell me what you thought of this album down in the comments below. Tell me how wrong my opinion is, as always, and I will see you in the next review.